Hello, welcome to this video about workplace wellbeing. My name is Vicky Kelly. I'm a coach and trainer. I work with a number of organisations on helping their employees to feel more peaceful and content in the workplace. And I do this in quite a different way to the way maybe you would expect. And I just want to use this video to share a little bit about why wellbeing is such an important topic at the moment and why it's actually not great, why we're not seeing people feeling well and happy, and we're seeing so many more instances of stress, anxiety, burnout, all those sorts of things. So it starts with what's really important to look at first of all is the problem, which is the misunderstanding of where wellbeing comes from, or where the absence of wellbeing perhaps comes from. So we're taught in the society throughout our lives to take the circumstances of our lives as being the thing to look at to see whether this is okay or not. And this will just happen really naturally in regular conversations that you have with people, where if, for instance, you were to say to somebody, I've been working 12-hour days this week because I've just had so much to do. It's highly likely the conditioning of our society will mean that the other person then responds directly to that with like, oh gosh, that's a really long time. I hope that you're doing things to look after yourself as well. Or something else along the lines of, oh, your employer shouldn't really expect that of you. That's too long. Your contracted hours are only 8 hours, so they're taking advantage of you, and you shouldn't let them do that. Whichever approach or the other thing they might say is, yeah, me too, it's terrible, isn't it? So whichever kind of response you get, it seems to be that we're kind of always being pointed to this idea that there's a certain number of hours which is acceptable to work. There's a certain way that employers should treat their staff, and that depending on how many hours you work and depending on how your employer treats you affects whether you're okay or not. And if that's something that we buy into as a culture, and then when we have conversations with one another, that's something that's going to be perpetuated more and more in society. So if you add into that kind of conditioned way of speaking and conversing with one another, how prevalent in the public eye it is at the moment to speak about mental health, anxiety, stress, stress-related illnesses, just general worries and pressure and all those sorts of things. It's really out there, and it's in front of us all the time. So then when people do have the experience of feeling it a little bit maybe overwhelmed, a little bit like they're worried that they can't keep up with the amount that they have to do, or that there might be some kind of problem if they don't achieve X, Y and Z. We start to feel the anxious feeling, which is a perfectly normal response to from our conditioning. But then we now also look to what society is telling us, which is like, oh, is that anxiety? Like, anxiety is really serious, and that's something that needs to be dealt with. So if you feel like that, you're actually also going to need to spend time doing mindfulness, meditating, taking up yoga. You're going to need to speak to somebody about the way that you feel. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. That's not what this video is about. But let's just say, for example, that you're in the position where the workload in your job at that point in time means that you are having to work 12-hour days to get the work done. So, and then there's a little bit of a feeling of a friction of worry, or am I actually going to get all this stuff done, and am I going to be okay if I don't? Oh, and also, am I going to be okay if I do? Am I going to do myself some kind of mischief if I put that much of my energy into this work? So if we take that mindset, and then we also add in the conditioning that, oh, actually you're now experiencing these mental health conditions, and that's not good. So now, on top of working 12 hours a day, you also need to find time for mindfulness. You also need to find time to do yoga, to go for a walk, that sort of thing. Actually, what we're really doing is we're putting another pressure on that person, and we're saying to them, we're further reinforcing the conditioning that if you don't do these things, you won't be okay. So we're taking somebody who already feels a little bit not okay and giving them more reasons to think that they will continue not to be okay. So that's kind of how, as a society, we've been working for quite some time now, and I think the cracks are really starting to show. So it's really important for me, that the work that I do, I'm so passionate about this, is sharing this different understanding of where our well-being actually comes from, and the difference between knowing that you're okay and believing that you need something else in order to be okay. So let's go back to our 12-hour day example, that it can really look to us, because of the conditioning that we've had, with the conversations that we've had, that 12 hours a day is not an acceptable a period of time to work. Now, I'm neither for nor against the idea of working for 12 hours a day. It's it's just a number, it's just time. What I do notice though is that if I had to work 12 hours a day and I felt that I shouldn't have to work 12 hours a day, then I'll suffer. Whereas if I worked 12 hours in a day without experiencing any resistance to the idea that I was going to be working 12 hours in that day, I feel absolutely fine. I have boundless energy in that kind of situation. So it's not the 12 hours that makes a difference between whether I feel good or bad. It's the judgment on whether I should or shouldn't be doing, or whether I have no judgment on it at all, that makes a difference to how I feel. And I know that that doesn't just apply to how I work and how much time I spend doing things. It might also apply to the way that somebody else treats me. So, for instance, if I was dealing with a client and they were a little bit short with me, then it'd be possible for me to think about that, like, oh, they're speaking to me in that way. They shouldn't do that. That's not an acceptable way to speak to another person. Or if they're speaking to me like that, then that means that they don't like me, and they might not want to work with me anymore, and it's not okay for me if I feel that I'm not liked, or it's not okay for me if I was to lose a client. So again, it's that extra thought, that bit of judgment that goes into that situation that affects me not feeling okay about it. Whereas actually, sometimes people are short with people just because they are suffering. So it's got absolutely nothing to do with the way the other person is showing up at all, and they're not even going to remember later that they were short with that person at that particular time. So we can kind of create this whole experience of suffering related to 2-3 second interchange with somebody else that isn't even aware that what they're doing could, in your eyes, be considered to be something that affects your well-being. But if we live in a world where we're conditioned to believe that it does, then we are going to experience suffering and an absence of well-being at that time. So what's really important for employees and employers, for that matter, to know is that well-being or wellness comes from the sense of being, not from the conditions that are arising within that sense of being. Now that's really quite a deep thing for me to say on such a brief video. I'm 8.5 minutes into this video. So that's the kind of thing that I would be getting into in much more detail if I was working with a client or with an organisation, with a group of people, or one-to-one. Helping them to understand that without the judgment of the situation, just going back to the sense of being that is present at all times, that's where wellness is. So in order to feel okay in the workplace or anywhere else for that matter, we don't need to be lining up our conditions in a certain way. That doesn't mean that we might not prefer to have certain conditions. That doesn't mean that we will go, right, well that's it, no more yoga, or I'm just going to treat people, I'm just going to snap at people, or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I am saying is that when we pay more attention to the sense of being than we do to the conditions, the sense of being lets us know that we are okay. Explore it for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. Actually kind of sit with that sense of being and see if you can find what I'm talking about. So from that place, from that sense of being in which we know that we are well, our well-being, we can then go outwards, back into the world, back into the workplace, knowing that we are okay. And when we come from that place, like I said before, whether it's 12 hours or not, whether it's someone being snappy at you or not, we can know that we're okay in those conditions, and therefore we can perform authentically. We can still give our best regardless of how much time has passed since we started our day's work, regardless of whether somebody snapped at us during the course of that day, regardless of how many meetings we still have to come that day. From the sense of being, from the sense of knowing where our wellness actually is, our well-being, then we can perform perfectly well in any workplace. So that's just a little taster. I'm going to be doing some more videos exploring this sort of thing. If this is something that you're interested in knowing more about, then I would be more than happy to have a conversation with you about how this could be implemented or discussed in your workplace, or just for you on a personal level. And if you're watching this before the 28th of March 2019, I do have a brief employee wellbeing taster session coming up as well. So the link to that will be in the notes.